Welcome back. In addition to past tariff threats that have kept the world on the edge on electronics, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and copper, we have added a new threat of a 50% tariff on the European Union, and recently even threats on Apple and Mattel as if they were countries in case, of course, they didn't start manufacturing their products in the United States. In the case of Europe, like most threats in the past, this tariff threat has been postponed until July 9. The reason for the threat: delays in negotiation. Demands: nonsense about VAT. VAT is not a trade barrier as it is paid by local producers too, not just importers. And in no way and nowhere we see even insinuations about corrections that are actually needed and would be useful, like ending the status of Ireland as a tax haven used by American corporations to avoid taxes, as most of its exports to the United States are nothing but accounting tricks to deflate taxable profits, taxable income here. The fact that our trade with the European Union is about 1 trillion makes the threat significant. The fact that Trump has reneged even on agreements he signed in his first administration, like the USMCA, which he replaced NAFTA after some minor changes. Meanwhile, the Fed is still trying to figure out the effects of Trump's tariff on the economy. Thus, with the data available on April 2, Liberation Day, the Dallas Federal Reserve, in case of retaliation, which is the most likely scenario, expected a 1% lower consumption on average, within a national range that goes from minus 2.9% to 2.6%. On the other hand, the San Francisco Federal Reserve expects 1% lower real income, with a national range that goes from minus 3% to 2%, and the Cleveland Federal Reserve survey to businesses shows significant negative effects on employment. Also, the Boston Federal Reserve shows business were caught unprepared for the level of tax hikes announced even before April 2. So we see a lot of caution here on the side of the Federal Reserve that could be understandable, though a bit inconvenient in case of a recession. Let's not forget that these white margins, which are distributed geographically in these studies, should also be should also be prepared for income levels like the New York Federal Reserve does in the case of inflation uncertainty, because it's small businesses and those with incomes under $100,000 and especially under $50,000, which are the less informed, the economic agents with narrower financial backs, and the most likely to be caught unprepared. The Federal Reserve refuses to cut interest rates and a recession starts. which not necessarily is going to lead to an inflation, but it could lead to discrete increases in prices if the workers if wages absorb the biggest impact of the tariffs, but the risk is there. And if financial markets wanted to believe that Trump would change his ways after the disruptions in the bond market, just immediately after Liberation Day, because they announced a financial crisis, the new tariff threats and subsequent suspensions seem to disabuse their naive faith in Trump as a practical man who learns from his mistake. In other words, a businessman. And when we talk about retaliation, if you add to all we have said, the fact that blocks like ASEAN, ASEAN are trying to present common front to Trump's bullying, and the way this may benefit Putin more than China, whose main problem is still going to be at inflation turning chronic, and is definitely not interested in a trade war. This could bring long-term foreign policy implications. So, in this point, so to end this video, I am going to react to some relevant articles in Foreign Affairs to see if they can help us put this moment in the right context. First, I'm going to discuss Alison Carnegie's article, When Trade Wars Become Shooting Wars. In the near term, countries can benefit from wielding trade as a cudgel, as the authors say, but in the long term, trade wars have almost everyone worse off. When countries frequently use economic leverage to secure concessions from vulnerable partners, investments and economic growth go down, which is something that also people like Farid Zakaria and Paul Krugman have noticed. Meanwhile, political instability goes up. The smooth Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 items, prompted a global trade war that intensified geopolitical rivalries and helped push Germany, Italy, and Japan toward autarky and expansionism. And compare that to the absurd USA policy of pushing both Putin and Xi in the same direction, where they should be isolating Putin. And there is even worse, much worse proposal, which is siding with Putin against China, as if Putin were an imbecile who doesn't know that in the next elections his relations with the United States may change, then he would find himself in a hard spot to come back to the yuan zone and make amends with Xi. So this is the level of stupidity of some proposals in foreign policy. And these, as tariffs, make the situation go worse and create visible parallels with 1938. Trump also wants to use the leverage from the tariffs to compel countries to sign bilateral agreements with the United States. The problem with bilateral agreements is that they always can be undercut by new deals between Washington and other governments, and which brings more uncertainty and therefore less investment. the international rule system which we inherited from FDR has been severely harmed by both Democrats and Republicans. And without a more solid system, we may find ourselves in a more fragile situation if China pushes more expansion, for instance, the expansion of BRICS and other arrangements in the global south and even Europe, as the United States proved to be a less reliable partner. Without reliable frameworks, international politics will become more uncertain and volatile, making miscalculation and conflict more likely. The situation could start to resemble, as I mentioned before, the situation that ended up in the Second World War, which partially resulted from the collapse of the League of Nations and the failure of European powers to nip German expansionism in the bud. Remember that in other videos, I have mentioned the main reason why we may be repeating history, which is that both Putin's economy as now as Hitler's economy in 1938 were particularly addicted to war, to defense spending. And they are not going to risk their position with the severe adjustment, economic adjustment that would be necessary if Putin adopted peace in Ukraine and everywhere else. Don't forget the way he is moving, making inroads in Africa, in the Sahel, in Afghanistan, and probably he will try to recover its positions in Syria. So there are relevant parallels with 1938, and we should act accordingly, which means we should isolate Putin and try to get into a deal with China using trade in order to, one, cutting Putin's lifeline in Ukraine, and two, persuading Xi Jinping to adopt the right policies to avoid the deflation that is making roots in the Chinese economy. Then we have another article which is also in foreign affairs, that is the global trading system was already broken, written by Michael Pettis. Don't forget that it was Michael Pettis who wrote the fundamentals. If you want, it's not a white paper, but if you want, it wrote the white paper on which the Trump's delusions on tariffs are based. Yet here, Michael Pettis says that the tariff regime Trump announced earlier this month is unlikely to solve the problem of trade imbalances, which is the issue that occupies Pettis the most. He also, on that I would agree, is that the best outcome would be a global trade agreement among economies that commit to managing their domestic economic imbalances rather than externalizing them in the form of trade surpluses. Well, if for that he means convincing, getting into a trade deal to convince Xi Jinping to adopt the right economic policies which are stimulating internal demand, consumers' demand, and cutting Putin's lifeline in Ukraine to reduce uncertainty and geopolitical risks that affect the system, well, I would agree. Yet, I have my discrepancies. The article assumes that you are more competitive in trade by suppressing wages, which may be true in the case of China, but not in the case of Germany. And wages may be important for trade competitiveness. China originally, Bangladesh today, Japan originally, but investment in research and development has become more important in today's China than cheap labor, and decreasingly due to the austerity of the 2010s. Also in Germany, let's not forget that the austerity that was imposed by Merkel on the German economy cut on research and development and therefore reduce their productivity, which is what is the main reason of the decline in Germany's manufacturing. Also, cheap imports not necessarily affect the whole employment negatively. Chinese solar panels, of course, kill the production of domestic solar panels, but also open a much bigger, well-paid field for services for on renewable energy and winterization, thanks precisely to the more affordability of those panels. In other words, more people could afford the panels and therefore demand services for those panels. More capital inflows may be positive despite trade deficits if they are directed to productive investment, something that has been highlighted by Krugman. It doesn't have to become more debt to finance consumptions. Also, you may use tools like quotas to protect industries for reasons of national security or resilience, like Biden tried after COVID, because the clumsy reaction of the Chinese government to the pandemic interrupted the supply chains, which was the main reason for the inflationary process that doomed the Biden administration. Then we have the next article, which is trade wars are easy to lose. And this article is very interesting. Countries with overall trade deficits like the United States spend more than they save. In trade wars, they give up or reduce the supply of things they need since the tariff make them more costly. Here, the author, Adam Posen, highlights something that I have already read in Krugman's articles, that trade is more about what you import than what you export. And he gives a very compelling example in the case of rare earths, especially because these rare earths and other minerals are located in very specific locations. It's not like copper, for instance, and only few of them, like in the case of graphite, have artificial substitutes. And he also highlights how the impact is felt in specific industries, locations, or households that face shortages, something or sometimes of necessary items, some of which are irreplaceable in the short term. This short term may hurt financially business and make all the difference between profitability and bankruptcy protections. So, deficit countries also import capital, which makes the United States more vulnerable to chips in sentiment about the reliability of its government and about its attractiveness as a place to do business. When the this is particularly true when the United States make capricious decisions to impose enormous, huge tax increases and great uncertainty on manufacturers' supply chains. Add to that the effect of decisions on other fields like massive deportations or huge irresponsible tax cuts that are going to skyrocket the debt. And you see that the result will be reduced investment into the United States, raising interest rates on its debt, and precisely pushing the United States to crisis that so far we have only seen in emerging markets. In fact, the US economy will suffer more than the Chinese economy will, and the suffering will only increase if the United States escalates, especially those without pricing power or are less informed, like small businesses and consumers with low income. The Trump administration may think it's acting tough, but it's in fact putting the US economy at the mercies of Chinese escalation. The United States will face shortages of critical inputs ranging from basic ingredients of most pharmaceuticals to inexpensive semiconductors used in cars and home appliances to critical minerals for industrial processes, including weapons production. It is widely reckless not to ensure alternative suppliers or adequate domestic production before cutting off trade. And we see that precisely the law that was addressing those issues, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to be defunded. Well, we have to still wait to see what happens after the big, beautiful bill comes out of the Senate, but that's the intention at least, to phase out and end those benefits. While we do nothing to end the red tape that was proposed by the Brookings Institution in climate-related projects that would reduce the time of the waiting time by concentrating permitting at the federal level. So that's why we have bizarre outcomes where MAGA's priority prevail over business common sense, and they try to, despite the fact that Texas is leading in renewable energy, these MAGA representatives try to end the benefits that would allow these infant industries to prosper and produce positive externalities. In other words, they are breaking ground, and if they are successful, others will follow on their steps because they are having successful and they are at the same time they are profitable. They are reducing the externalities created by polluters. Unfortunately, The Biden administration has a mixed record, and the Trump administration, just for I cannot say ideological reasons, but I would say for the whims of his MAGA base, is trying to undo one of the things Biden did right in his administration. Then we have the next article, which is The Age of Tariffs, written by Eswar Prasad. Here, the author addresses the issue of retaliation, saying that retaliation will increase uncertainty, but if the countries affected by tariffs appease to Trump, that will also lead to instability, as the opposition in those countries will react to the humiliation and retaliate once they are in power, or diversify to reduce their exposure, diversify their trade, of course, to reduce exposure to the United States, and so that will lead to higher uncertainty anyway. In the end, they'll go around the United States because in the short term that's hard to do, but in the long term it's not, especially if the result is a global recession. And Democrats are unable to present an alternative to Trump. Let's remember that Biden followed many of Trump's policies on trade, so they have to present an alternative to Biden and to Trump. It's not enough to say that Trump is wrong or that the water is wet. They have to present an alternative. With respect to Biden, he made the economy more resilient, granted, but after Trump, more clear guidelines are needed. Not ambiguous phrases like the coupling and the risking. On the other hand, because we have to introduce, assuming, for instance, that Democrats will come back with a good platform in 2029, they have to be able to introduce uncertainty in a world that is going to be justifiably skeptical of the United States. On the other hand, risks associated to the supply chains that are linked to China's poor management of the pandemic, the time bomb its overcapacities creating just because she resists stimulating consumer demand, and its borderline trade relations with Putin must be addressed. It must be made part of this economic trade overhaul of our relations, which should be inspired by the rule system we inherited from FDR, and that we progressively began to erode, for instance, in the case of when the times we undermined the World Trade Organization. Also, we need correctives to introduce rules, guidelines to correct China's reprobable past actions, like entering the World Trade Organization to gain access to other countries' markets for its export, while limiting access to its own markets. That's something that has happened in other Asian countries, but in the case of China, because of its size, is particularly important. Also, we should correct the use of extensive subsidies and other measures to boost the global competitiveness of its companies, including the forcing foreign firms to hand over technology and currency manipulation. Of course, we have to come to terms with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a way of introducing subsidies so the better way to address the situation is to bring them to the spotlight and discussing them because the trade system is broken, yes, but it has also been broken with the complacent participation of the United States. So we need to introduce certainty where others have introduced so much uncertainty. Then finally, we have another article, How Trump Could Dethrone the Dollar, written by Edward Fishman and others. Commanding as the dollar may be, Trump's return to office has created a genuine threat to its status for the first time in generations, given the lack of all alternatives. The damage is unlikely to be immediately fatal or felt, but the risk and probable pace of terminal decline has increased. At the least, transactions will erode the factors that supporting the dollar's dominance. In his first weeks in office, Trump pursued policies that led to a strong dollar, but since then the greenback has slumped. When he say this, he's talking about the first tariffs that led the dollar to be appreciated. But since then, the greenback has slumped against other currencies. At first, the dollar rallied as U.S. interest rates rose on the back of Trump's inflationary policies, including tariffs, deportations, and proposed tax cuts. These are the factors that have produced this weird outcome, and the general context of uncertainty should lead to seek the dollar and treasuries as safe havens. Those same policies, however, and the economic uncertainty they have created are now weighing on the dollar as markets expect them to hurt the U.S. growth substantially, especially following the announcement of Trump's aggressive and far-reaching global tariffs. As countries search for ways to limit their exposure to Trump's whims, they are unlikely to rapidly reduce their dollar dependence, but in time, growing trade relations with China and other major economies could give businesses an alternative to replace the dollar in some transactions. And let me mention here something that I have not mentioned before. That is sometimes that you hear very idiotic observations saying that the China is trying to be number one. But it's not going to. China, I don't believe they are trying to be number one to begin with. They would have to have huge deficits they refuse to have to create a liquid and deep market for the yuan or renminbi, if you prefer that denomination. So what I believe is that China wants the participation of the yuan to grow just enough to make it the currency of transactions within the yuan zone. This could have a very important geopolitical consequence. That is that SWIFT, that is the mechanisms through which payments are made in the overwhelming majority of transactions, then be sidelined. And if so, any sanctions the United States, justifiably or not, wants to impose would be meaningless. Then, as more countries come under US sanctions, they will be motivated to do what Russia did after 2018 and reduce their reliance on the dollar for cross-border trade and currency reserves, just what I was mentioning. Even if these countries don't shift away from the dollar entirely or replace it with a single dominant alternative, other payment systems like SIPs could start looking more attractive rather than reshaping their trade patterns to fit US preferences. Countries will reshape their financial infrastructure to keep trade flowing. And yeah, so you could have a yuan dominant as a transaction currency in a yuan zone, yuan trade zone, and investment zone, while the dollar may still be, a little bit beaten, but still may still be the reserve currency preferred by most countries. Those are not incompatible. Then the author says perhaps the biggest danger to the dollar's dominance comes from Trump's threats to the rule of law, which will shake the foundation on which the dollar's standing rests. This has also been noticed by Zachary and Krugman. And on that, we also get an unrepentant Trump ramming the democratic system every week with new bizarre things, where even people who are being, well, even historians are being fired because they want to rewrite history. Just to mention the level of the transformation Trump wants to champion, while Democrats still are playing dead. Finally, the author addresses the issue of the Mar-a-Lago Court, which I have also mentioned in another video, and says that the solution to the increasing debt and trade imbalances through the Mar-a-Lago Court would make this problem significantly worse, either by forcing countries to take a loss on their US bond holdings, which will scare away future buyers, or if the swap is involuntary, it may even be classified as a default by credit rating agencies. And in that video, I also mentioned how this idea is inspired by the Plaza Court, which tried to stimulate manufacturing exports from the United States through a revaluation of the Dutch mark and the yen. And yes, it created some effect on sports, but currency manipulation is not enough when it comes to manufacturing policy. You need also a stimulus, you need to prepare the labor force, you need to prepare many factors that Trump is not addressing, and on the contrary, for which he's cutting funds, like, for instance, and most of all, research and development. As we learned from the 50s and 60s, especially, of great, remarkable memory is Kennedy's race to the moon, and all the applications, though, that research and development found in civilian issues. And having said that, let me leave you with our newscast.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and these are the main headlines of this hour. Among other news,
new 266 executive decisions were released in the Oval Office during the weekend. Among them, A. The United States Court of International Trade is declared day and unconstitutional. All its decisions will be declared void and null, and its assets will be seized by the Trump Organization. The Supreme Court will have 24 hours to arrange the legal stuff required to implement this executive decision. B. Ban on international students will improve the chances of American students by allowing at least half of them to claim they were in the upper half. The other half would have to join the Republican Party to improve their job opportunities, declared President Trump. White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles will be forbidden to make faces, cry in the White House facilities, or vent her frustration by engaging in drinking alcohol or drug abuse. As President Trump makes America great again, she will have to observe the decorum proper of a chief of staff. HHS Secretary returns from tour that will improve her skills for her position in Trump administration. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem expands her tour to the Western Wall in Israel, to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum in Poland, the Trail of Tears Museum in Missouri, and the Kids in Cages ice facilities in Texas. It's been a very fun tour. It showed me how worse people can suffer and what we can do to make their suffering deeper. It was like killing that puppy again, declared the HHS secretary as she returned from her second vacation. After finishing her first vacation making cosplay of first responders and thickening her resume with doctored images that improved her credentials as a Republican. Trump gives unhinged speech at West Point. Among other declarations, President Trump addressed issues like a. Career advice. Whenever some billionaire approaches you with ideas like Golden Dome, Death Star, F-47, or crazy things like that, you just say yes. You never know if that is going to land you an executive job at Raytheon with bonuses and stock options. B. Trophy wives. When it comes to trophy wives, Slovenia is the best provider. Just make sure you hire a lawyer like Roy Cohn for the contract. Never sign whatever the supplier gives you. And make sure you have an unlimited return clause. C. Golf. Not many understand what a good trophy wife contract can do for your investments. Take the case of Ivana, for instance. Her contract allowed me to bury her in Bedminster, which worked wonders for the golf course in taxes. In time, the same with Melania. Another golf course, maybe Mar-a-Lago. And a lower tax bill. D. The Great Late Al Capone. What many people don't get from the Great Late Al Capone is that he always fought back government and the courts, and in the end, they could never catch him. Let his example guide you in all your decisions. In touching re-encounter, former President Biden meets his dog Commander at Canadian Embassy. Former President Biden briefly met his dog, Commander, who has received asylum in the Canadian Embassy since the pardon that liberated him from responsibility for the corpses found in a grave located in the gardens of the White House was revoked by President Trump. So tender was the scene that nobody dared to correct Biden when he repeatedly called Commander, Hunter, Hunter, as he petted him.
This has been the news of this hour. Sponsored by Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? Did you vote for Trump in 2016 and then in 2020? This is the right church for you. If so, Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit is the only Christian church that can promise you in the Lord to have 72 virgins in heaven for only a donation of $50 a month. You will have access to those 72 virgins in heaven. For an additional $25, you will be allowed to replace 10 of them, and for $100, Heaven Premium, you will be allowed to choose them for yourself. Guaranteed, if you're not satisfied with those 72 virgins after you die, full refund of your money. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.